Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I'm Brahim Aude, and the topic for tonight is ethnic rainbow, myth or reality. And to discuss this topic, we have three guests. Marion Kelly, Professor Emerita of Ethnic Studies, and Rick Baldoz, Assistant Professor of Sociology, and Jonathan Okamura, Assistant Professor of Ethnic Studies, all at the University of Hawaii, Manoa. And what we're gonna do is take a look at this notion of ethnic rainbow, because of late it has come into discussion also. And so what we're gonna do first is play a segment from an interview I did with Noe Silva, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Hawaii, and then we discuss those issues.
Because of the involuntary nature of how our people were drafted into the United States, because our kupuna just 100 years ago experienced that traumatic loss of their own nationhood, and because of the other forces of colonialism that dispossessed our people from land, that also, and I think another huge trauma that our grandparents and great-grandparents, and we are still going through, is the forced loss of our language, our ancestral language, which at one time was our national language. My grandparents' generation was forced to go to school in English and no longer be able to communicate with their grandparents. That was a trauma that our people went through, along with the other traumas. The result of those traumas and of the attempts to assimilate into, American culture has resulted in our people having the worst life statistics of anybody in Hawaii. The most poor and just the worst statistics in terms of health, incarceration, literacy, you name it. Those are directly related to each other. And so because of that history, our issues are first of all different, and the way they need to be addressed is different. What happens with the discourse about the ethnic rainbow, it's a beautiful image, but it allows for people to sort of buy into a myth that everything is perfect and equal, and so we don't need to address anything special in regard to Native Hawaiians. We don't need to make sure that they're going to school and that they're getting higher education degrees. We don't need to make special arrangements to make sure they get on the land. We don't need to make sure that they have Kamehameha schools, and we don't need to make sure that they have special health programs. Well, we do need to do those things.
So, Marion, we do need to do those things. Given the history of Hawaii and Hawaiians and missionaries and all that good stuff that you already done a lot of research on, how would you react to this notion of ethnic rainbow?
Oh, the same way that she did. Oh, God, that's terrible. First of all, Hawaiians had a matriarchal society, and in comes this patriarchal society that changes everything. And women selected the men that they wanted to marry, to live with. And it's the opposite thing in Haole society. And from the very beginning, the visits of these Western ships coming here, bringing all these foreign diseases that Hawaiians didn't have, and even with Cook's ship, when the Cook ships came back after they went Mauka and came back again, and the Hawaiians came out to them and said, "Our people are dying from contact we had with your ships, with your people on your ships." It was terrible. And I think that the death of Cook was brought on by himself. He was attempting to kidnap a high chief in order to get a little boat back, just opposite people. Just as Noi Noi said, they're just has another culture. It's just another culture. It's a culture that was sensitive to other people. To be sure, there were battles, but the battles were among the chiefs. The people didn't participate in them. So this was a whole nother society. And when Westerners came here, they changed it. The missionaries come and they look down on the Hawaiians because they're not Christians, These people were good people. They had their culture going. They had organized agriculture. They had really good things going for themselves. And when Westerners come with opposite
system,
the opposite system, but an opposite viewpoint of people, then they really had a terrible time.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So, Jonathan, given like that particular history, and then, as Noi Noi said, like we as native Hawaiians still suffering from the effects of that. So, can we like look at this ethnic rainbow without looking at that particular history? Can you dehistoricize this kind of ethnic rainbow that we are talking about?
Well, the proponents of this idea take that kind of view that Hawaiians aren't different from any other racial or ethnic minority in Hawaii, that they're not the indigenous people, or that they don't have any special privileges based on that historical fact. And they would like to erase history in many ways, or their interpretation of history is such that it erases much of the inequalities that have occurred, not just to Hawaiians, but some of the other groups that subsequently came to Hawaii and have not succeeded to the same extent, for example, Filipinos or Samoans. But let me also just explain a little bit about the notion of an ethnic rainbow. Historically, this started during the 1920s already in Hawaii with some of Rick's predecessors in the sociology department, like Romanzo Adams. But then subsequently, it expanded to this idea in the early 1990s of Hawaii as a model, a multicultural model for other societies. And this idea appeared about a month ago in the Sunday paper,
John Griffin,
opinion piece written by John Griffin. 12 years previously, his wife had written a similar article called Hawaii, the Ethnic Rainbow, Shining Color Side by Side. The same title, same kind of symbolism, which has replaced the notion of Hawaii as a melting pot, perhaps. So this is the kind of idea that has expanded from just the notion of Hawaii as a place of very tolerant, harmonious, egalitarian ethnic relations to the idea that we have solved these kinds of problems. We can serve as a model for other racially and ethnically divided societies.
Great. So, Rick, from your perspective as a sociologist, and I know that you teach racism and ethnicity in Hawaii as well, why this emphasis of late on this notion of ethnic rainbow, do you think?
Well, it could be that I don't think it ever went away, for one. I think it's sort of one way of marketing Hawaii as this sort of destination for people to come to that's a very safe and a place where people don't have to worry about the problems of the mainland or other places. And one of the things I think Noi's piece shows is that this notion of this kind of harmonious ethnic relations doesn't really jibe with the realities when we look at the history of Hawaiians, not only in the colonial period where it's had all sorts of violence and intrigue, but also in the contemporary period, right? We have all kinds of antagonisms between Native Hawaiians over ceded lands, over Kamehameha schools, over Hawaiian entitlements. That's not harmony. That's, antagonism. It's in the legal realm, so it's not the kind of ethnic conflict that sometimes people see in other places, but it's certainly not something I would characterize as harmonious, right? There's really enduring conflicts and antagonisms.
That's good. I just want to remind our viewers that this is a live show, and we'd like to hear from you, comments, questions, on Oahu 956-5670, and on the neighbor islands 1-800-342-7949. What I'd like to do now is I interviewed Ruth Hsu from the Department of English, and we talked about issues of sovereignty and so on. So we'll watch that and then we comment on it and expand further.
The issue has to do with, very much the issue of sovereignty, which includes the right and the ability of a people to self-define, to say, this is who we are, this is what we're about, and this is what our lineage and our heritage consists of. So for the rest of us, though, I think we have to be very careful about understanding where certain talk comes from. So if I name a group a certain thing, I don't do that from a place of neutrality. I don't do that from a place of political vacuum or historical vacuum. I have a certain position as a person hired from the mainland, from the United States, a United States Institute of Higher Education. I myself immigrated to the United States from Hong Kong. So I may not identify with a particular notion of China. I identify with other notions of Chineseness. And so when I speak from that whole perspective. So I think it's really incumbent upon us, those of us who have lived here for a long time, and those of us who have in one way or another committed ourselves to issues of social justice, to be very aware of how we speak and why it is that we say certain things, because how we behave will affect the ongoing struggle that Hawaiians are engaged in right now.
Marian, there you go. I mean, there is this whole notion of what would your relationship be to Hawaii and the native Hawaiian if you are an immigrant or if you are from somewhere else and came here. And the question of self-identification are very important in terms of Hawaiians asserting their identity and so on. So what this has to do with the question of all of us are equal in the rainbow, in the spectrum of the rainbow. How does that jibe with your research and your understanding and activism in terms of Hawaii politics? And,
Yes, I would like to answer that in a peculiar way. First of all, I'd like to say something about the missionaries that came from America. And they really looked down on the Hawaiians. The Hawaiians did not speak very much English. The Hawaiians were not educated as they were. And so they came here to judge the Hawaiians, really. And very few Hawaiians got to be on the side of the missionaries. And some of them that did, when they died, or even before they died, they went back to their Hawaiianness. The concept that you had to be educated, you had to have a job, you had to do this or do that in order to be accepted by the white people who came here. One of the things that happened was when the missionaries and their children got land through their whole system, they set it up so they could get land. And there's a whole story to that. They didn't want to go to the Marshall Islands. There was no land there, just water and sand. And so they elected to stay here in Hawaii. It was much more mountains and good land and things like that. But once they got here and got the land, they had to hire Hawaiians. And they hired mainly they hired Hawaiian women to work in their factories to make the things that they wanted to sell. and they kind of stayed away from the Hawaiian men because they're too macho, too macho. Anyhow, one of the things that didn't happen was the Hawaiians did not catch on. They actually really rejected this lifestyle. And so the next thing, when the plantations started evolving and getting more and more land for sugar to sell to the Americans, and there was a big struggle over that. They got Pearl Harbor, and the Americans got Pearl Harbor so they could use Pearl Harbor to go to the Philippines and capture the Philippines. You know, it was a terrible mess in the world, and the Americans were in the middle of it. And so when they got to setting up the system here that they had, the Hawaiians were really left out, and they imported the Filipinos. They had imported Chinese first because the trade with China was going on. They imported the Chinese,
Japanese,
and the Japanese trade with Japan, and then the Filipinos, and they just ignored the Hawaiians, absolutely ignored them, and they've been ignored ever since.
Yeah.
And this whole thing about ethnic rainbow, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, because you know the history that you are recounting is the basis for what's going on right
now.
You know,
exactly.
and Rick, I just wanted to ask you in regards to you know the power factor in this notion of ethnic rainbow. How do you locate it, and what does it mean given the politics extant?
Well, in some ways, the myth is that it's a myth, but it's also a sort of dangerous ideology in the sense that with the notion of an ethnically harmonious society, people who are at the bottom of the social hierarchy are sort of invisible to the larger social policy network because they don't exist in an ethnic harmonious system like we're supposed to have in Hawaii. So I think it's a way of rendering invisible the sorts of structured and pattern inequalities in Hawaii over long periods of time. And I think that's where it's dangerous in sort of ignoring these sort of long-term patterns of stratification in Hawaii.
Yeah. John, I just wanted, because you talked about the pedigree for this ethnic rainbow. So could you expand a little bit on it as to what was, the ideology behind that, if you expand on that?
Well, as early as 1926, Romanzo Adams, the first scholar of race relations in Hawaii, wrote something on the racial melting pot in Hawaii, and he focused on the relatively high intermarriage rate, which of course compared to the U.S. continent was high, almost 20%. And also emphasized that in Hawaii there were no laws against interracial marriage, which was again in contrast to the U.S. continent. I think some 37 states had such laws. And this intermarriage rate was taken as almost symptomatic of the very positive kinds of race relations that existed, as though intermarriage was the only sort of race relations that were possible. And I think the idea is built on that, and subsequently Lind and Horman emphasized equality of opportunity among groups in Hawaii. Lind himself said, there are obvious inequalities, but he argued that over time the differences would become less and less in terms of occupational status, education, and income status. I'm still waiting for those differences to disappear, but nonetheless, he maintained that up until 1982 in his last article on ethnic and race relations in Hawaii. Other kinds of factors that are discussed in terms of this notion of Hawaii as an ethnic rainbow is local culture and identity, that this is what is the basis for these tolerant, harmonious relations among people, that we share a common local culture, and that common local culture has arisen because of the contributions of all the different groups to Hawaii that somehow have blended together, mixed, such that this local culture has emerged and serves as the basis for everyone to get along with each other. That eliminates, of course, the fact that we have many groups that are not considered local in Hawaii.
Yeah. Yeah, but given all that, I mean, if you look at things, Rick, you find there's some basis for that talk about the local culture and so on. But still, as Jonathan said, a lot of other people who've been here a long time are not considered local. You know? I mean, would you consider, for instance, Samoan local or Tongan or something? Why not these guys, but some other people? I mean, could you?
Right. Well, I think that's a difficult question, especially for someone who's not local themselves. I think that the term local, especially in the way in which John has used it in his scholarly work, is less salient today, especially when I talk to my students about this very issue. They seem somewhat alienated from the very kind of political dimensions of local identity that were part of the 1960s and 70s and 80s. And they seem to have a much more, they sort of buy into this very kind of touchy-feely ethnic rainbow type of thinking. And then when they talk about, when I talk to them about the kind of structural inequalities between different racial and ethnic groups in Hawaii, they get very confused because they've never heard that. It's something that seems strange to them. How could that happen in ethnic paradise?
Yeah, good. So at this point, I'd like to go to another segment with Noe Silva to just expand the topic further in terms of what kind of backlash we're having now. Okay.
We in Hawaii are being caught up in a backlash that originated in the United States, and it's a backlash to affirmative action or any kind of progress that was made through the civil rights movement. And my colleagues here, John Goldberg-Hiller and Neil Milner, have written at least one paper, probably more, showing how these groups such as Colorblind America and these other kinds of anti-affirmative action groups are using the civil rights talk, civil rights discourse from the civil rights era that was meant to be able to identify and correct historical wrongs against certain minorities in American life. They were taking that discourse of civil rights and turning it against minorities in the United States. And that's also what's being used against us here, exactly what you're saying. Under the United States Constitution and laws, if you don't take into account any of that history, right, and you just try to go by the law, you can certainly make an argument, and they are making those arguments, that you can't single out a certain group and say we're going to have a special program for these people. Well, that's only possible if you disregard all of these things that we've been talking about, the history of what's happened to our people.
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting. Here we have like these people who talk about colorblind America and introduce those lawsuits and challenges against Native Hawaiians, etc. And they say that they are in defense of democracy and freedom and equality and so on. At the same time, it seems to me what they are doing is trying to divide the population and create all kinds of contradictions within that, so that the ethnic rainbow that they might be promoting or some such thing might explode in their faces. So what do you have to say to that, Marian?
Well, I don't think the Hawaiians are going to explode in their faces.
No. I mean, in terms of this notion of ethnic rainbow. Not,
ethnic rainbow.
Yeah.
I think Hawaiians have been struggling through their life. A few of them have come through. A few of them have gone to universities and gotten degrees and things like that. But the majority of Hawaiians are still out on the west coast of Oahu and other areas in the country without jobs, without money, and perhaps in drugs, I'm not sure. But most of the Hawaiians that are in the jail are, most of the people that are in jail are Hawaiians. And this is not equality. This is not a chance to be equal among all people. So that this concept of everybody's equal and everybody has the right chances to do this and do that, it's not true. It is not the reality of what we're living now. there is great inequality, and you can't erase it by just saying there is no, we're all equal. It's not true.
Yeah. The other thing, Rick, that I think the ethnic rainbow doesn't take into account, or any such model, like whether it's the multicultural model or whatever, doesn't take into account the issue of class and the power relationship. So could you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah. Well, I think the question you raised about these right-wing legal organizations that have come to Hawaii recently to try to challenge various Hawaiian entitlements, and on the mainland challenging affirmative action programs, things like that, are attempting to challenge or undermine institutions or policies that have been put into place to recognize the legacies of racism and colonialism in the United States. And if those programs and institutions continue to exist, or in the case of Kamehameha Schools, thrive, that continues to bring light onto these legacies, right? And these groups are doing everything they can to try to sweep those sorts of things under the rug. And they've spent a lot of money here trying to do that, and it's quite disingenuous for them to use the language of civil rights or Martin Luther King, which they often do. It's quite disturbing, certainly not in the spirit of the kinds of politics represented by the civil rights movement. So hopefully people can challenge the kind of shallowness of that kind of political organization.
Yeah. Also, like in terms of the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King, he had like an international point of view. He had like peace, conflict resolution and peace and a peaceful approach to things, and nonviolence and all that kind of stuff. But it seems to me that these people who are making those kinds of charges and trying to challenge Native Hawaiian rights and so on are actually trying to take the islands into more of a conflict pattern than something that really talks about peace and democracy and love and freedom, because I don't see they have much love for the Native Hawaiians, no matter how much they protest against what I've just said.
Well, there's an interesting twist on that, because the movement in Hawaii that has been directed against Native Hawaiian rights is called Aloha for All, led by William Burgess and his group. They're the people behind the Arakaki 2 suit that was dismissed in court, but they've already said they're going to appeal to the federal court in San Francisco. We have to keep in mind, Rice lost his cases here initially in Hawaii. He lost in San Francisco, and then he appealed to the Supreme Court, where he finally prevailed in 2002. And this group, led by this Aloha for All movement, may very well lose in San Francisco, but I think with national support from groups that Nanoy mentioned earlier, Campaign for a Colorblind America, actually, which doesn't exist, but there are other groups like the Center for Equal Opportunity, Center for Individual Rights. These groups are very likely to support these kinds of cases because their approach is nationwide, and as these cases are heard, they support them financially, and once they get to the Supreme Court, of course, finance the hiring of the attorneys. Let me also follow up what you said. The discourse on equality that these groups use is one based on individual equality.
Absolutely.
Right. Following on the arguments of the civil rights movement, they're not concerned with group equalities, as Marion mentioned, because these inequalities still persist. So the whole notion of discrimination is the denial of individual rights. So even a white male like Freddie Rice can claim he was discriminated in the restrictions on OHA voting, and this is the same argument used against OHA and DHHL at present, that non-Hawaiians are being denied individual rights that Hawaiians are being granted supposedly on the basis of special privileges.
Yeah, and that's why you need the history that Marion was recounting, because of the conflict between individual rights and collective rights in this case, and to get that collective rights understanding, etc., and see that those issues regarding Native Hawaiians are nothing individual. It is just a matter of collective rights and so on, and protected under international law and all that kind of stuff. So that is the thing that because they want this Institute for Individual Rights, etc., they want to do it that way, so that they can say if individual rights are violated, therefore there is discrimination. And they look at it as an issue of race and not like as an issue of relationship between Native Hawaiians as an indigenous group and the United States. And there's a whole history of that. So they dehistoricize this kind of thing and become, in that sense, anti-historical to try and promote their ideas and so forth. And so there must be a reason for all this thing. So anyway, what I want to do now is go to another segment with Ruth Hsu, and she talks about problems of power and some questions of problems with the rainbow kind of metaphor.
The other thing I think about the image of the rainbow is that it does suggest that we don't have, demographically speaking, any particular ethnic group that is dominant. But I think what is often at play in a culture and in a society, socioeconomically and politically, is a very complex interplay between numbers, but also relative power. So a minority can have, relatively speaking, more power than other majority groups. And we've seen this in a number of countries. For example, the one that springs to mind right away was the old South Africa, the apartheid South Africa, in which you have a tiny minority basically controlling and dominating the majority of black South Africans. So I think culturally in Hawaii, I would identify the values and the drives and the desires of this country as being very aligned, of this place, this location, as being very aligned with a dominant group in the U.S., which I still would, roughly categorize as Euro-Anglo, more or less self-identifying as Protestant, as coming from a Western European tradition, capitalistic, industrialized.
Capitalistic, industrialized, I would add service economy, real estate development, and so what has all this got to do with the rainbow? I mean, we talked a little bit about it. But, I mean, where's the notion, I mean, in terms of relative power? Power, where is that notion in this rainbow? I mean, we talked about it, but...
I don't know about the rainbow. It can be a beautiful scene in the sky, but I don't think it's here. And, when those missionaries came here, they made sure that they got the land. And they could buy land from the chiefs. They gave the chiefs a lot of land. And they could buy land for 50 cents an acre or less. And, so they got the land for their sugar. And they didn't care about the Hawaiians. They used them as laborers. But when the chips were down, they and their children and their grandchildren ruled Hawaii completely. I'm sorry, but my father worked for Lauren A. Thurston, who was a grandchild of the original Thurston. And they were after money, that's all. And they had the newspapers, the advertiser, they had whatever it took to influence the local population that they were doing very well. But the missionaries made sure, and the children and grandchildren of the missionaries made sure that they were in control, and they're still in control.
Yeah,
And
but
when I came up to university, this is a dozen years ago, more than that, 2 dozen years ago, maybe 3 dozen. There were no Hawaiians on the staff. There were no Japanese on the staff. And when I got here as a student, we were surprised when the sociology department hired a Japanese man. We said, oh, things are beginning to break down. that was an unusual situation because everybody else was Haole.
It's interesting you're talking about this, but some people might say, well, that was then, but we are here now. But I want to talk about this Saunders Hall. You know, what was its name before that? Porteous.
Porteous.
I mean, and it took, in the 1990s
struggle.
now, it took such a long time to
right.
just change a name.
That's
So
right.
what does this tell us about the, that metaphor of rainbow, and the question of power, and the question of who really controls, what's happening on campus, and what the racism that, these kinds of issues express or reflect. Rick,
Well, I think it's an interesting example because often when I talk to my students about the racial and ethnic hierarchy in Hawaii, I ask them to try to explain why it is that groups like Filipinos and Native Hawaiians and Samoans are at the bottom of the hierarchy. And the usual explanation has something to do with their personal shortcomings, right? Behavioral problems. And this feeds into the Porteous idea,
yeah.
right, of that Filipinos were like children, needed to be developed by their white masters over time. And the students tend to actually still articulate variations on that kind of theme. That I ask them often about stereotypes of different groups. Every group I've ever had says all Filipinos carry knives, they're sexually promiscuous, Hawaiians are lazy, which of course then explains why these groups are at the bottom of the hierarchy, right? Because of their personal shortcomings, not because of structural advantages or disadvantages built into the political economy of Hawaii.
Yeah, and then there are all kinds of, like in the literature, for instance, blues hanging, for instance, there was a lot of, those were tumultuous times in the 1998, with the Association for Asian American Studies, etc. So, if those kinds of literatures and so on are still being produced, and you're talking about students coming and you're talking with them and they have those ideas, what does that say about the educational system and the cultural production that we have here, or some of it, in terms of, is it promoting the ethnic rainbow or is it not? And in this case, where is the ethnic rainbow going, if it's going, if it is anywhere at this point beyond being up in there in the sky? So, John, could you speak to those?
The different sources of this idea, literature being one, politicians, journalists who get articles advancing this notion published and read by thousands of people in Hawaii. The idea that Ruth just mentioned about minorities, it's related to the Hawaii multicultural model. There are no majorities here. We're all minorities.
Right.
Because no group constitutes more than half of the population, as though a group needs that kind of percentage in order to have power. So all of that kind of discourse obscures the fact that there are groups of majority status and other groups of minority status. And
the
there's this
sociological sense of the
yes,
word.
yes, in terms of having greater power, the issue that you raised. And then what I find is that the model is being advanced by those in power, representatives of Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, and Haoles. Because these are the groups that benefit most from the model, insofar as the inequalities, the disadvantages faced by Hawaiians, Filipinos, Samoans, other minorities are obscured by this continuous emphasis on harmony, equality, and tolerance. So much like what Rick mentioned, the explanation of inequalities has to do with the shortcomings of representatives of these groups, not the kind of structural disadvantage that they face.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about, educational reform and so on. Well, we may as well begin with those things that we were talking about. This is the kind of educational reform. We have a caller. Is it Jeff from Waipahu?
Yes.
From Waipahu, yeah. Jeff.
Hi. I actually have a couple of comments first and then a question.
Sure.
First thing I want to note that I love your arguments about the ethnic rainbow metaphor and how it's a myth. But, for a lot of us locals, it's also a reality. You cannot ignore the fact that it's real for a lot of people, especially people who are mixed backgrounds, people who have mixed ethnicity. And I think that's something that's missing from the discourse here. Something that's missing from the conversation is the fact that here in the islands here, a lot of us are mixed, and we, it's when I hear talk about groups as if they're members of like monolithic or bounded groups, as if like everyone's all like the same, essentialized in a category or something. It kind of disturbs me a little bit, because I think that there is like a kernel of truth for some people about this ethnic rainbow, because we've bought into it for so long. And so the question I have is, where does multi-ethnicity, multi-raciality play in all of this discourse going on?
Yeah, this is, thank you very much. It's a great question and very good comment. And in fact, I was leading into it, so I'm glad you did that, because it's more problematical than we are talking about it. So that was the next issue. So anyone would want to take this, Rick? Or
I'd like to say something.
Yeah.
Ethnic studies was accepted after a big struggle up here at the university. And there was no Hawaiian studies. That came later.
Yeah.
And so what ethnic studies proposed to do was to give the histories of the Hawaiians, the Japanese who are here, give the histories of the Chinese, of the Filipinos, of the people who are considered minorities but aren't. So ethnic studies was very important. But the fact that the University of Hawaii did not accept ethnic studies, we had to struggle for it. And then after that, only Hawaiian studies was born.
Yeah, right. So Rick, would you want to expand on the issues that Jeff was talking about?
Well, I don't necessarily disagree, although one component of this ethnic melting pot argument that John talks about in his work has to do with intermarriage as being some kind of indicator of ethnic harmony, and it has to do with this notion of decreasing the social distance between groups, and once they intermingle, they'll understand each other. And there may be some kernel of truth in that notion, but of course, to have a relationship or even to be married to someone of a different ethnic or racial group doesn't mean that the relationship is equitable. I mean, there's lots of haole guys that have mail order brides from the Philippines or Thailand.
Yeah.
I hardly think of those as equitable relationships.
Right.
So that in and of itself doesn't determine that there's going to be some kind of transformation in the social relations. One of the things that we often talk about in sociology has to do with looking at the labor market in places like Hawaii and looking at how certain ethnic groups monopolize certain sorts of occupations, especially professional occupations, and 85 to 86% of the jobs in the U.S. are not advertised in the classifieds, but are actually gained through personal contacts, family members, acquaintances, networks, and these are often reproduced in these sorts of ethnic networks.
Yes. Yeah. Good. Before I want to ask you, about that. But before we do this, let's go to Ruth Sue, and I interviewed her about multiculturalism, and then we can open it up.
Multiculturalism, I think, is another problematic term. I think over the past 10 or 20 years, multiculturalism in the dominant form has come to mean a kind of warmed over pluralism, where you have different ethnic groups separated out, and they exist in certain aspects separated out from the other ethnic groups. They don't intermingle, and yet their evolution is not allowed to remain, untroubled. There is intervention, and that intervention, I think, for the most part, comes from the dominant values, the dominant culture. So I think multiculturalism from a position of hope has devolved into some kind of warmed over pluralism.
So here we have rainbow, multiculturalism, and warmed over pluralism. But actually, we can integrate those kinds of notions with what Jeff brought about, because I think it's a legitimate thing, especially here in Hawaii. So could you speak to that, John?
Well, the emphasis on multiculturalism is a way of erasing race. That's why the notion of Hawaii as a model emphasizes it's a multicultural model rather than a multi-ethnic or multiracial model. This is all part of a kind of emphasis on ethnicity, too, in studies of ethnic and race relations in the U.S., that American society has gone beyond race. We're a post-racial society, the emphasis being more in terms of ethnicity, ethnic relations based on distinctive cultures, because these kinds of barriers are much easier to overcome than racial barriers. So it's a way of arguing for the declining significance of race in American society with this emphasis on culture and ethnicity. Going back to Jeff's comment, majority of babies born in Hawaii are multiracial or multi-ethnic, and that's been a recent development that, of course, it follows from the high rate of intermarriage. Lynn himself argued for what he called the golden men in his novel on Hawaii more than 40 years ago. And Griffin also mentioned the fact that we have such a high proportion of people are multiracial, multi-ethnic descent. So supposedly, they would not align themselves in these monolithic categories that Jeff alluded to, and this is going to be the basis of much more tolerant relations, because people cannot divide themselves. They have these cross-cutting ties as a result of having membership in more than one group. But interracial marriage has been the case in Hawaii for many years, for many decades.
Yeah.
And it hasn't necessarily abolished the inequalities that existed before. It doesn't necessarily mean that if one is multiracial, that is the chosen identity that they will take. They still can align themselves with one group over another, as is the case with many Native Hawaiians.
Yeah, I mean, like you find some Native Hawaiian who looks like Japanese. I mean, he might have well, I don't know, 1/8 or something Native Hawaiian, but culturally. So the definition has to be self-definition. And it has to be, what culture have you been brought up, regardless of how you look and so on. So these are very important considerations as well. Also because, I mean, here we are not like the continental United States, where people beat up each other too much and, that kind of stuff. So that creates the image of, we are really an ethnic rainbow, etc. Yeah, there is some kind of peace, quote unquote, but actually if you dig in a little bit deep, you find that peace is just like skin deep, nothing much more than that, because of the inequality and so on. So what I want to do now is talking about, and something we brought up is the question of the educational system, and the educational curriculum, because of what you mentioned about your students and so on. So that brought up the question. So I interviewed Noe Silva, and she has some concerns in terms of the educational curriculum and so on. So we'll see that.
Of concern is probably educational curriculum, which presents each ethnicity discretely without really noticing the crossovers that's between them. That's one thing that comes to mind, so that you might have a section taught about Hawaiians, a section taught about Chinese, a section taught about Japanese, and so forth, that sort of thing. And I think that's kind of a problem. And then also just the sort of public discourse that basically creates or reinforces a myth that everything's equal in Hawaii, we're all the same, and so we don't need to, have any special concern, say, for indigenous rights.
Yeah, and so, I mean, the question of indigenous rights is a focal point in this debate, and in the question of how Hawaii society is organized. I mean, I think this is critical. But also, actually what I want to do also is, in terms of also education, go to another segment by Noe, on the question of, okay, here we are professors, and so what can we do to try and talk differently about those particular topics and educate ourselves and others, our students and others in the community. So we'll see that.
We can get our students to see what happens when images, for example, are deployed that, you know, pretend to be a true image of a true, authentic, whatever, Chinese, Hawaiian, Filipino, whatever, and then see what's really a, you know, what is a real person. Right, so we can teach about those kinds of things, and then we can also teach, it really helps to teach the true history, or the histories, the many histories of what actually happened here and is still continuing to happen here. It's also important to have our young folks, you know, come into that knowledge and encourage them to be involved in policy making and in public affairs, to express themselves politically and otherwise, you know, even in literature or whatever it is, so that they can begin to get things made right.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are important points. But, you know, John, you teach about Japanese in Hawaii. And ethnic studies teaches about Japanese experience, Chinese experience, and so forth. And yet, when you, because Noe made a very important point, you cannot say, well, let's talk about the history of Japanese and let's forget about everybody else. So how, you know, I know from ethnic studies we don't do that, although we talk about Filipinos and so on. So how do you teach your Japanese course?
Well, I put them in the context of multi-ethnic Hawaii, so that the relations and status of Japanese is always understood in that larger context, whether it's historical or contemporary. We start off talking about the kinds of struggles that Japanese Americans experienced on the plantations and moving off the plantations up until World War II in the context of what's been referred to as the anti-Japanese movement. But once they've attained political power and economic, higher economic status, I kind of problematize that issue and say, well, given that status, now, what has happened to other groups in consequence? In the present situation, one can hardly refer to Japanese Americans as a disadvantaged group. Now, are they also responsible at this moment in history for this disadvantaged status of other groups? Are there ways in which they have not provided for equality of opportunity for these groups that may in fact have limited the possibilities for socioeconomic or political advancement?
Yeah, so Rick, on the question of, you know, now everybody talks about globalization, you know, and transnationalism and so on, and these are like value-laden terms in and of themselves. But in terms of the question of multi-ethnic society, multicultural society, ethnic rainbow, how does that relate in terms of globalization along capitalist lines, for instance? You know, is there some kind of relationship there, talking about this and talking about the globalization issue?
Well, one thing I think we can, that I try to do in my courses is to, one of the explanations of trying to talk about Filipinos and Native Hawaiians and Samoans being at the bottom of the social hierarchies, to talk specifically about the kind of colonial histories experienced by those groups, and to link that to these issues of globalization, economic expansion, how different groups and territories were brought into the global capitalist system, and to also reflect critically on the contemporary period. Why is it that the poor nations like Mexico or the Philippines have such massive outmigration of their peoples all over the world to work in demeaning jobs in the Middle East or East Asia or the United States, and to sort of look at the sort of legacies and the residues of colonialism as something that we can't just easily leave in the past, something that continues to resonate today, and certainly the Native Hawaiian experience is part of that sort of discussion, I think.
Yeah, it seems to me, Mariam, that so long there is like inequality, and so long there is no recognition of Native Hawaiian rights, especially Native Hawaiian rights, and the power differential among various groups, Filipinos, Samoans, Tongans, and so on, and the Haole. So what does that say in terms of really the question of the ethnic rainbow? I mean, here again, the ethnic rainbow, faces a hurdle, and the hurdle of inequality and power differentials.
Well, the ethnic rainbow faces the reality of life here in Hawaii. And the reality of life is not a rainbow. It is very difficult for a lot of people, especially the Hawaiians.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, so anyway, what I'm going to do now is, do we have a caller here? Who's the caller? I'm sorry.
George, I think.
George from Kaimuki. Okay, George, you're on the air. And we have just a couple of more minutes left. Hello?
Yes, hello.
Yeah. Could you make it quick because we just have a couple of minutes, but thank
Yes.
you for calling.
Quick question. John was
Sure.
talking about problematizing the experience of the Japanese Americans in Hawaii. Is there such a thing for the native Hawaiians? Has that been over-problematized? Are we looking at the kinds of problems that perhaps make unintended victims out of people
Right, okay.
through
Could
their
you-
history?
Yeah, thank you.
We're not that at all.
Yeah, sure.
Thank
Thanks, George. Could you say something quickly about it, because you mentioned the problematizing factor before we go into something else?
Well, quickly, then, what I was trying to get is a lot of Japanese Americans would see their history in Hawaii as a success story, and I'm saying, well, maybe we should problematize that. It's not necessarily due to the hard work, sacrifice, perseverance. There could have been some ways in which they disadvantaged groups along the way, as I mentioned earlier. That's how what I
Right.
mean as a
Okay.
problem.
Great. So I want to go to our last segment interview with Ruth, and we're just, talking about what needs to be done. We'll watch that and then we continue on.
One of the responsibilities and big challenges for the next 10 years, 20 years, however long the Academy survives some of the social processes that are going on now, would have to be educating ourselves about the past, because that is the foundation for trying to come up with a more complete picture of the current reality. I don't necessarily think that we all the time on every subject and in every instance know more than our students. I think we can learn a lot from their reality and how they perceive their world to be and what they perceive their needs to be. I think academics and educators are also particularly responsible for issues of social justice. And I think this statement in itself is going to be cause for a lot of debate, because I personally know a lot of educators who would disagree with that.
Yeah, and that's true, and actually it's a very interesting notion and idea about what our responsibilities are and how we can learn from our students and so forth. But the other thing is that this kind of ethnic rainbow, multiculturalism, etc., needs to be challenged, and hopefully what we have done is begin the process of discussion and challenging that thing, and educate ourselves and try to educate others also as well. So we're basically out of time. So thank you very much for coming in, and thanks for our viewers for watching, and thanks for your comments and questions. Mahalo. See you next month.